Okay, welcome to Class 5 of Introduction to Flash, Spring 2013 at Santa Rosa Junior College. Today we are going to be covering some things that we covered to a pretty thorough extent last week: keyframes in the timeline, tweening, the difference between shape tweens and motion tweens, and then some things we haven't really covered: motion guides, motion presets, animating masks, shape hints, and if time allows, though today it might not, IK poses and 3D tools. And that's fine if we don't cover those, because those are topics for next week anyway. So before we jump into that, there was some chat on the forum about some problems with some files, keyframes and whatnot. And really, I put this on the FAQ page, but I'll make it more prominent. Anytime you're spending a lot of time on an assignment and it's not making sense, then just upload the FLA file, your working file, to the Dropbox and send me an email telling me you did that, and I will look at the file. Because there are times, especially when you're new to a program, like Flash especially, which is a pretty confusing program in certain respects, that you're just not going to be very productive with your time unless you reach out and get some help. So make sure that if you do run into issues with trying to understand why something's not going the way you expect, that you just upload the file and send me an email about that. In addition, there were two people who uploaded their FLA file to the Dropbox instead of their SWF file. As a reminder, as it says on the homework page, you want to upload just your SWF file, only your FLA when you're running into problems. Okay, so there is just a quick student work examples. We saw this last week. We've got the work examples from our static animation. And I've received about 10 or 12 files for homework 2.swf, which is due by midnight tonight, February 14th. I gave you guys an extra day because our class is a day later. And I'm going to start the class by showing that to you. So I'm going to launch Adobe Bridge. And this is a great opportunity just to see one of the great things that Adobe Bridge can do, which is it can show you all kinds of different file types without you having to use any other program. In other words, with Adobe Bridge, I can show you each one of the hw2.swf files that were uploaded for this assignment. Another thing that I want to share with you, when I'm sharing my screen and you're seeing an animation like this, which is a shell turning into another shell, different types of shells, which is really cool, it's going to look jerky because there's just so many things being rendered. The screen is being shared, and then the file is rendering as well. So if it looks choppy, that's why. Okay, so that's one example. Here's another airplane scene. And it's nice also, by the way, we're seeing people reuse their scenes from their static scenes. Some people don't, some people do. Either way, it's entirely fine. A nice fishing scene here. Let's go fishing. And we've got some plane action and that kind of stuff. Likes the beach. So you're seeing what your classmates are doing And the nice thing is, as per the specifications of the assignment, I am seeing, like in this one, a very clear example of frame-by-frame animation, that being the birds in the sky, and then a shape tween down below, right? Moving on, we'll take a look at a couple more. This one's a little challenging. We see some things flashing across the screen. Oh, happy Valentine's Day. Goes pretty fast there, but we can see a clear example of the morphing, also known as the shape tween at the bottom, and the heart being the motion tween at the top. Okay, here we see a clear example of the frame by frame being the kangaroo, the way the feet are moving there, right? And the motion tween up in the sky. Okay, and then there's also a shape tween there, but not that clear. Here we see, again, it's happening pretty fast, and the head is turning, so that's the frame by frame, and then we're seeing the either motion tween or shape tween going into the lettering. Okay. Nice and slow. We see our shape tween at the bottom, our motion tween at the top. Okay. There's another example of frame by frame, the kangaroo jumping along, the motion tween of the sun in the sky, and the shape tween of the letters into the koala. So that's a really nice example of all three. So Jane Madama put that together, and you can see, clearly all three different types of tweens occurring, and each of them is appropriate for the object. In other words, the sun moving across the sky like that is appropriate for motion tween. The letters morphing into the koala is appropriate for the shape tween, and the way the feet are moving as the kangaroo is drifting across the foreground is appropriate for the frame by frame because of the way the feet have to be adjusted. And that's best accomplished with a frame by frame. Okay, here is, ooh, the walking. Oh, that was nice. We'll see Mario again. Here he comes, Mario, and look at the feet. Really nice job on that, Chris McPherson. Okay, got a couple more here. And if, I guess, I'll let you guys see the rest of this up in the gallery because of the fact that we don't have that much time today. I don't want to, I know this is kind of fun to do, but I want to make sure that we get to the things we really need to deal with, which are related to some Flash concepts. Okay, so back to, where were we here? Flash Web Animation Assignments, February 14th. So, keyframes and the timeline. Okay, so I'm launching Flash, and the first thing I'm going to talk to you about, and this part is review. We did this fairly thoroughly last class, so as Flash is launching, I'll just say that there are several different types of frames that show up on the timeline. The ones with a little circle at the bottom are keyframes, and there are really two kinds of keyframes. There are filled keyframes, and there are blank keyframes. So, for example, let me just open a whole bunch of files here. Okay, opening, 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 opening. Okay, so if I just use, let's see which one will have both kinds on it. Okay, so if I look at this file here, and this is from Chapter 5 of the book, you'll see on the airplane, takeoff, diagram, and background layers, there are little black circles. Those black circles indicate a keyframe, and a keyframe is something that holds content. Okay? A filled keyframe, that is. But it's referred to as a keyframe. It's not referred to as a filled keyframe. The distinction between a keyframe and a blank keyframe is a blank keyframe is a circle, but it's not filled, and the timeline is also empty. That means that on that layer, there is no content at that time. If I hide all of my layers, you'll see that the landing layer, the only layer that is not hidden right now, is my landing layer. The landing layer has nothing on that first keyframe, but when we get out to frame 30, we see there is something on that layer. It's probably some white text. Yes, it is. So let me change the color. So there's actually just some text on that layer at that point. Okay, so that's the difference between a keyframe and a blank keyframe. Another issue that came up, Anna, I think, was asking me, my keyboard shortcuts for the Mac aren't working for those shortcuts that you mentioned last week. So first of all, let me go over the different types of keyboard shortcuts there are for frames, keyframes, and blank keyframes. So there's the F5, F6, and F7 shortcuts. F5 simply adds frames. In other words, if I have this timeline where it says explanation, if I wanted to add frames, I would just hold the F5 key down, and there you can see my timeline is getting longer. So all I'm doing is adding regular frames. I'm just stretching them out. I'm stretching out the amount of time that any object appears on the stage. I'm just going to ignore that annoying phone. So now I'm going to hold the Shift key down and the same F5 keyboard shortcut to erase those frames. So here I go, there they go, and I just keep on going with my Shift and F5 key to remove those frames. Okay, so if I wanted to add keyframes, okay, sorry, yeah, that's actually the surgery center calling in to see how I'm doing. Okay, so we can see that it's easy to add it's easy to add frames with the F5 key. It's equally easy to add keyframes by holding the F6 key. And you see the difference is that it adds a little black filled circle every time I hold the F6 key down. The Shift F6 key does the opposite. The only part about that that's harder is that to remove them, you have to go back to the first one and go Shift F6. And you actually have to do every single one individually. So it's a little trickier, and I guess maybe the Flash programmers are saying, well, you know, creating a frame-by-frame animation is an arduous process to begin with. So taking away those keyframes that you so painstakingly added should be an arduous process as well. Of course, that's probably not what they're thinking, but I'm just making that up. Then we have blank keyframes. And adding a blank keyframe is really when you are wanting to create a shape tween. It's really the best time that you would use it. So I'm just going to type in shape tween here. I'm going to hide these layers. Okay? And I'm going to put here an F and make that text bigger. change it to something a little more interesting and change its size. That's as big as it wants to go, huh? 200, we'll go 200. Okay, oh, that is one funky looking letter. Let's change that. It's extra filled, so that's too much like a Dunkin' Donut. Okay, let's try Poplar, fine. Okay, so there's my F. And now if I wanted to change that into an L, I would go out to frame 5 and hit F7. F7 enters a blank keyframe. I hit the F7. But before I do that, as I said earlier, I did receive some emails about, well, my function keys don't work. You right-click on the timeline, and you can say Insert Blank Keyframe. You can also say Insert Keyframe. You can also say Insert Frame. Okay? So you don't need to have those function keys working in order to find the functionality there. The other way to do it, and this is the most time-consuming way, is choose Insert Timeline, and then you can do Frame, Keyframe, or Blank Keyframe. Okay? But the idea is when you put in a blank keyframe, it puts in and it takes off the content from your stage. And the fact that we see this little weird green shape here is just some kind of artifact that's coming from someplace. So if I would go here, I would now say L, and I'd probably want to position it in the same place. And then I'd go out to frame 10, hit the F7 key, go here and say A, go to frame 15, F7, click and say S, go to frame 20, F7, click and say H. And for all of these to actually be turned into a shape tween, I have to break that apart. And again, here's I think one of the takeaways that I want to stress today is that I can use my keyboard shortcut Control-B because I remember that. But if I don't, I can just right-click and I can find Break Apart. So I go to each one of those keyframes and I'll use my, now that I showed you that, I'll use my keyboard shortcut, which is Control-B, to break apart my letters. Now, I've got this layer that is ready to be shape tweened. Right now, what kind of tween are we seeing on the stage on that layer? What kind of tween is that? Because there is a tween that's happening on that shape tween layer, but it's not a shape tween. It is exactly a frame by frame. So here's another thing about just the difference. So we're looking at keyframes. We're looking at what they look like on the timeline. We saw the blank keyframes on the timeline. Another thing that is important to notice is when you take a layer that has a bunch of keyframes on it and you want to turn it into a tween, in this case a shape tween, you can see that there's 5 different keyframes there. What I would do in this case is I'd click on the first one, hold the Shift key and click on the last keyframe, and now I have 5 different keyframes there, and now I can right-click and say Create Shape Tween. And notice it created a shape tween here at the end, which it has a broken dotted line there. So 2 things. First of all, we created a true shape tween from this letter to this letter, to this letter, to this letter, to this letter. But even though I only held this first keyframe on this frame 20, even though I only selected that keyframe of that set of frames, it created a new shape tween to the end. And the reason why the line is broken is because there's no other frame. There's no other keyframe there. So I have to just right-click and say Remove the tween, because that section is static. It's not changing at frame 20 to 26, right? So this timeline should make a lot of sense to you. You see green and keyframe, arrow, keyframe, arrow, keyframe, arrow, keyframe, arrow, meaning it is shape tweening from one to the other. Okay? Whereas this down here is a static timeline that star is not moving, right? you also notice something else that's happening in this timeline, and that is this layer where it says explanation has a different kind of symbol representing the layer. It's a guide layer. So when you're working on a project and you want to have some notes for yourself, you create a guide layer which has a bunch of notes like that, but it won't publish because guide layers don't publish. How do you create a guide layer, you ask? You right-click and you just choose Guide. Okay? So two things are happening along with all of the other review of frames. Two things are happening in our in our exploration today. That is emphasizing how you can right-click on the timeline and you can use your keyboard shortcuts. But right-clicking not only in your timeline, but on your layers, on your stage, any elements that you've got on the stage. Anytime you right-click, you're going to get to a fairly extensive contextual menu that will help you out to, rather than having to go up to the menu bar at the top and start futzing around figuring out where things are. Okay? So hopefully that explanation having to do with keyframes, blank keyframes, and frames, adding them and taking them away is useful. Are there any questions at this point? A couple of no's. Jeannie might be typing something. Okay, good. Lots of people are like, no, move on, dude. Close that file. Okay, I'll continue on, and when Jeannie's message comes up, when a symbol flashes. Okay, so Jeannie, a symbol is flashing because it's disappearing from the timeline. So let's take a look at this plane taking off. Right? We see that plane taking off. Oh no, that's the airplane. Where does it say the word takeoff? There's the word takeoff. We see the word takeoff and then the takeoff disappears, right? But let me just do something here. Let me copy this, and then I'm going to go like this. I'm going to put a blank keyframe here, and then I'm going to put a keyframe here, and I'm going to paste that thing, and I'll put a frame, and then I'll put a blank keyframe, and then I'll put one more keyframe, and I'll paste that, and then I'll put a frame. So now let's look at the word takeoff on the right-hand side of the screen, and only pay attention to this layer, takeoff. As a matter of fact, I'm going to increase the height of this layer just so we can really focus on that. Okay, so there's this layer takeoff. We see on frame 1, there's content on the layer takeoff. On frame 7 or 8, that content disappears. Then it shows up, then it disappears, then it shows up. It's flashing, right? That's what you have to be aware of. Is if you see white space on a timeline, that means you don't have any content on that layer. So you remove the content from the timeline. You can either kill the whole layer by selecting the layer and removing it from the trash, or you can, if you need to have that content on the timeline, you remove the blank keyframes, in which case the content from the prior keyframe will carry over to the next keyframe. Okay, does that make sense, Jeannie? Jean, I don't know which way you pronounce it. With the E or without? Okay, it makes sense. Good. So that's really a fundamental thing. No, Lee, got it. That's a fundamental. When I first started teaching, when I was first exposed to Flash from my high school students about 15 years ago, I was teaching a program called Director, which is a very well-developed program. And I found Flash to be ridiculously quirky, and stuff would disappear and it would show up, and why is this frame white and this one is filled? And and of course I've gotten used to it over the years, but the important element to remember is when you see a empty circle, that means that is a blank space within that timeline. Okay? Okay, so enough said about that, keyframes in the timeline. Tweening, we've talked about shape tweening, we've talked about, let's just review very quickly the motion tweening aspect. Flash. So, motion tween, right. If we look, let me try this one. This is a good one for it. Let me get rid of this here. Okay, so if we look, I described to you the circles, the filled circles and the empty circles. But what about these two right over here? Let me right-click on the airplane layer and make it bigger by right-clicking and choosing Properties and changing the layer height to 300. So now when we look at that layer, we see that on frame 10 or 11 and frame 12, there are these two diamond shapes. The diamond shapes represent that some type of motion tween was happening. The other thing that you'll always notice about a motion tween layer, and this is something that I went over last week, the way that you know that it's a motion tween is because it's blue. The diamond shapes indicate keyframes that are placed on there when you right-click on it and you say create key, create, it's not showing here because it's already, let me try to do it this way, create motion tween. Okay, as soon as you create a motion tween and move symbols around on the stage at different points in the timeline, it's going to show up as blue, and those diamond shapes are going to indicate where you have changed the properties of that symbol in time. Now Gene's asking, how do you remove the white space? Keep in mind, if I selected this and I went from here to here, from frame 1 to frame 29, if I removed the white space, what I'd be doing is you can't remove the white space unless you want to move the landing word, which is here, back to the beginning. Because this white space indicates that there is nothing on that timeline during those milliseconds of time. The white space is there for a reason. It's there to indicate that the content on that particular layer doesn't show up until frame 30. If I remove this white space by selecting it all and say remove frames, then what happens is that landing text moves to the beginning. You see? You can't not have white space if you want to have control. If you want that landing to happen at the end, then there have to be 29 frames of white space until it shows up. Okay? So I'm going to move that back to the end. And notice just by dragging that, it created the white space, indicating that there is nothing on that timeline during that time. Now, if the white space bothers you, you can always right-click on it and go to the Properties panel where it says Frame and say, this time is unused on this layer. Okay? Notice how I used the Properties panel. I chose Frame, put these two little forward slashes, indicating that this is a comment. Okay? So I don't think there's anything about tweening, the three types of tweening that we've discussed, shape tweening, motion tweening, and frame by frame, which is not tweening really, but it's another form of animation that we haven't gone over thoroughly. Now let me talk to you about motion guides. Let me make a little marker in here. Okay, so how do motion guides work? Let me close. I won't close this. Maybe I'll use this as an example. Let me see. Okay, I'll use this one as an example. Okay, so you'll see here that in going over everything that we've talked about, we've got this shape morph where the sun is coming down and turning into a bird. You can barely see that. That's our shape tween. It's called this guy called it a morph just because it's morphing, but it's a tween. We've got our airplane, which is a motion tween. We know it's a motion tween because it's blue. It has the diamond indicating a change of the frame, and we see it works like that. We've got the same thing with the sun. It's another motion tween, and all it's doing is it's rotating. We've got the shadow, which is showing up down below like that. And all three of those are motion tweens. They're happening, in each case, they're happening to a symbol. Look at my properties panel in the top right-hand corner. I choose the airplane, it's a graphic symbol. I choose the shadow, another graphic symbol, and I choose the sun, another graphic symbol. Okay? Limited amount of flexibility with graphic symbols, but certainly appropriate for this type of animation. So we see, though, that the airplane in particular, and let's hide the sun and hide the shadow, we see that the airplane has a motion guide already. Well, this is a feature of Flash CS5 and CS6, that you simply right-click on a symbol and you can create a motion guide. How did we used to do it before that? We used to create a let's see. Oh, there's nothing there yet. All right. Where did you do it? Okay, here's what I'm going to do to make this happen. I'm going to copy this. I'm just going to copy this shape. I'm going to kill this layer and this layer, and I'm going to create a new layer. And this is classic tween. Okay? So what I would do here is I would, I'm going to hide this airplane layer. I would put my object on the timeline. The sun layer doesn't have a diamond, it has it at the end, and it's because it's not moving, it's just rotating. Okay, so here, let's get back to classic tween. I have this object, and this is how we used to do all of our animations before CS5. You'd create your object, and then you'd have to right-click at the end, and then insert another keyframe, and then you would move it maybe to the other side of the screen. Okay, so I've got one here, I've got one there, and in between those two keyframes, I would right-click and say create. At the time, it didn't say create classic tween, but that's what it says now, create tween. And we see that it's purple, but it's not. It doesn't have any path that it's following. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to say add. You'd have to right-click on that layer and choose Add Classic Motion Guide. Okay, so then I would take my pencil tool and I would draw something like that. I'd go to the first frame of that layer with the object that's being tweened, which is the plane, and I'd make sure I'd use my Move tool, and I'd make sure that that circle in the middle, that's the registration point, and we've talked about the registration point before. It's where the object rotates around. That registration point is attached to that pencil line. And then I'd go out to the last frame of that classic tween, and I'd pull that object and snap that registration point to that pencil line. So now what we're going to see, if I go back to the beginning, is that classic tweened object is snapped to this pencil line. And at the end, the last frame of that classic tween, the circle is snapped to that pencil line as well. So the object follows that line. Okay? Another thing about that is when I select that element Let's see, did they do away with that? Let's see if I can find it, if it's there. Okay, another thing that you'll notice, if you select a classic tween, any frame in between the keyframes that are being tweened, you'll see your properties where it talks about tweening. You can say orient to the path. So that way, as the plane is following up the line, it tilts its nose up. As it's following down the line, it tilts its nose down. But actually, it's not going to be tilting its nose, is it? What is it going to be tilting based on here? In other words, when it follows that pencil line, if I say orient to path, how is it going to orient itself to that path that's going up and then going down and then going up? Where is it going to base its orientation on? Well, not from the tail section, but it isn't from the nose. From the center, right, from the registration point. So if I want to make sure that it orients from the nose, I would make a little change. I would choose the Free Transform tool. I would drag that registration point to the nose. And then I'd go out to that last frame, drag the registration point to the nose again, and then go back to my Move tool and put that back on the path. Okay? So now, we're just about there. I'm going to drag this down a little bit. I now select that any frame in between, and so watch what happens before I orient to the path. I'll hit the Enter key. It's just kind of, you know, flying the way people would like their jets to fly when they're passengers. But if you were a hotshot pilot, you'd want to orient to the path, so it would fly like this instead. Okay, so you can see there's some kind of nifty things about classic tweens that you don't get with the newfangled motion tween. Okay, anyway, that was a bunch of content. I put in a table of contents marker to say that I was talking about motion guides. So if you need to review any of that, you'll know where to go. Okay, moving on. Motion presets. Something that I also talked about, but it bears repeating. Let me put a little marker in here. Motion presets. So, how does a motion preset work? Well, by the way, that line, just to finish up the topic, it's just something important to say. When I publish it, that line won't publish. Guide layers do not publish. So here, when I test my movie by going Control-Enter or Command-Return, you'll see, and of course we see two planes because all that stuff that is hidden is still publishing. But we can see that that one plane, we don't see any pencil line there, right? Okay. Now, back to what I was saying about motion presets. In classic view, and I'm going to hide, actually I'm going to get rid of these two layers that I just created after all that hard work. Okay. I'll hide those two just so we can focus on motion presets. In classic view, motion presets show up as this little icon right here. I can open up this set of subpanels by just clicking on this double-headed arrow, and we see here are my motion presets. There are a bunch of default presets. Let me just pull this out here for a second so you can see them a little clearer. There are a bunch of default presets that are already built in, and if I select any one of them, I'll see what those presets look like. So I can use my arrow keys to go down, and I can watch my different presets, a bunch of bounces, a bunch of blurs flying in, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So something blurs, flies in, and then flies out, all kinds of things like that. So let's say I like this one, fly in, pause, fly out. When would I use something like this? Maybe I want a car to show up on my screen for a minute. And since I want a car to show up on my screen, it's a great opportunity to quickly bring in an object from the web and just use that object. So, perfect. I have this car. I right-click on it. I say, copy the image. And of course, this is for just testing purposes. I'm not going to be using somebody else's content inappropriately. Paste it. Okay, so right here we see this car. What I would do at this point is I would turn it into a vector shape. Modify bitmap. Or let me select it. There we go. Modify bitmap and trace that bitmap. And I talked to you about this last week, I believe. And then I can come in here and get rid of all that other stuff that maybe I don't want for right now. I'll get my lasso tool and I'll get rid of that line at the bottom. And this is where I hope not to get the wheels. I'm using my mouse, so this is always tricky. And get rid of that. And that is just fine. Okay, so I have this little shape here. I'm going to select it all. And if I want to use one of these motion presets, well, a motion preset is something that is related to a motion tween. So what kind of element does this have to be in order for me to motion tween it? Can it be just the shape that it is now? It has to be converted to a symbol. That's correct. Movie clip would work. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to convert it to a symbol. And I could use the keyboard shortcut F8. But for those people who have challenges with their keyboard shortcuts, again, you would just right-click. And once you see the right-click contextual menu, you see Convert to Symbol. At that point, I can choose MC Car as its name, MC standing for movie clip, so I keep everything in my library in order according to symbol type, and then I choose my type, movie clip, and then I can say OK. So now here's my layer 3. I'm going to move this element off to down here. I'm going to select that element on the first frame. I'm going to choose my fly in, pause, fly out, and choose apply. And let's continue all the rest of these frames out to that so they all end at the same time. But let's take a look at what happens with just this car. So we can see when I scrub the playback head, it's in motion, and then it freezes. Actually, and I can move these around. So what I might do is get the section where it's static a lot closer, right? So I can hold my, I believe it's my Alt key. No, that's not it. This is my Control. One of these, this is one of those things that I find the hardest to do, is to remember which keyboard shortcut is going to move this keyframe to where I want it to be, because I just want to move that one keyframe. So I have to choose it. And you see, this is one of those times that actually the keyboard shortcuts are not enough. So it's just a matter of knowing which keyframe to use. I mean, which keyboard shortcut to use. There it goes. And I moved it. Oh, I put it in an extra one. I didn't want to put it in an extra one. I'm trying all my keyboard shortcuts to figure out which one is going to do this. And this is one of those, it's not that I've not done this about 40 or 50 times. This is one of those that I have to have probably put on my wall so I can remember it. If I click, yeah, okay, I just clicked and dragged it. So I'm going to click and drag this one too. There we go. So what we see is now we've got a lot of motion, and then right there, it's no longer in motion, and then it starts up again, and it gets more blurry. Okay? So when I publish this now, all of these other layers, the sun, the shadow of the plane, as well as the background graphics, they're all going to show up, and we see that. Okay? So the idea of a motion preset, the main takeaway here for you on the motion preset is that you've got to create a symbol in order for the motion preset to apply. Okay? When you remove an object from the stage, does it stay on the layer it was drawn, or can you then drag it back? You can, once you remove it from the stage, it's removed from the layer as well, right? Because the timeline layers just represent the content that's on the stage. Okay? So that's what we have to know about. Whoopsie, we don't want to see my cathedral in the background. We want to see my assignments page. So that's what we need to know about motion presets. What about animating masks? Okay, animating masks is pretty easy to do. Let me give you an example. Right here, I have another set of layers that look different than the standard layers you have seen. The explanation layer I already talked about earlier today, and let me put a marker in here. Okay, we're talking about animating masks. The explanation layer is a layer that the icon associated with that layer is now familiar to you. That's essentially a layer that has some content in it that will not publish, right? That's where you put your explanations. But what about these two layers underneath it? Well, this is what I'm going to redo here by selecting this layer and getting rid of it. So I have this plane. Okay, the plane is just sitting there, right? What if I wanted this plane to be revealed just like it's not, what do you call it? It's not a fade, but it's a reveal. You know, if you want to reveal from right to left or something like that. What you would do is you would create a mask, and the way a mask works in Flash is that you can have the mask move, and if the mask is moving, then the object is becoming revealed. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to call this mask. I'm going to select my rectangle tool, and I'm just going to create a box. Okay? I'm going to select that box, and it's since there's a stroke on the box, which is unnecessary, but it showed up that way because I didn't check in my my options to turn the stroke off. It doesn't matter. What I want to do here is I want to turn this into a symbol. So I'll right-click on it, and I'll choose Convert to Symbol, and I'll call it MC SQ mask, SQ standing for square, because I think I have a different mask already in there. Now that this is a mask, now that this is a symbol, I want to turn this into a motion tween, and you'll see why in a second. I'll say Create Motion Tween, and then on the last frame of its tween, I'm going to hold the Shift key and just move it straight across the stage from there to there. So now all that's happening is that that box is moving across the stage. Okay? But the whole purpose here is to have that, essentially what's going to happen when I mask the airplane beneath the mask, what's going to happen is as this rectangle goes over the object, it's going to reveal that object and then hide the object that isn't exposed by the mask. In other words, that rectangle is the only part of the airplane that is going to be revealed when you create a shape on top of another shape, and a shape on top of another layer, turn that top shape into a symbol, and then make it mask the layer beneath it. The way you make it mask is you right-click on that layer, you right-click on the layer below, and you say Properties, and say, oh, okay, that's grayed out. Okay, let me try it again. Mask, and I'll do that again. So you see, there's the mask, there's the layer beneath it. I right-click and I choose Mask, and the content layer becomes indented, indicating that the layer above is masking it. Both layers become hidden, not hidden, both layers become locked by default, and then what you see is this. Okay, so that's how it's going to publish. If you need to get more control over the object, then you want to unlock it so you can see what part is going to be masking the object below it. That wasn't a great explanation. I can't apparently do any better in explaining it. The process is easier than the way I made it sound. Okay? But you can see that technique is fairly straightforward. And let me do it in a jiffy so you can see it again. There's my content. I create a new layer. I call it Mask. Maybe I already have an element in my library that is going to work for this. In this case, we know I do. I've got a star. I've got this mask. I've got this mask. Doesn't matter which one. I'll take this one out. I'll drop it on that first frame of the layer on top. I will, on top of the content that I want to reveal, I'll create a motion tween. I'll go to the last layer, hold the Shift key, and pull it across. Now that object is going to go across the screen and reveal as it goes. It shouldn't be called a mask. It should be called a reveal. And then I'm going to right-click on it and choose Mask. The layer beneath it gets indented. Both of those layers become locked so you can visualize what's going to happen. Okay? Inverting the mask like you could in Photoshop? No. Can't do that. Okay? So that's how masking works. There's a lot of interesting things you can do with masks. That's one of those things that I would encourage you to, go out to a search engine and type in creating masks in Flash tutorial. And there's a bunch out there that are kind of interesting. Okay, I want to make sure I get to everything today because I'm not going to. I have to leave in about 10 minutes, and I want to leave a little time for questions. So, shape hints. Shape hinting. Shape hinting is something that you do when you're working with shapes only. Okay, so here's the part that's important about that. We've talked about tweening, we've talked about motion and classic tweens, we've talked about frame by frame. This shape tweening, the one piece that I want to add to the conversation is that you can use shape hints to control how an element tweens. And you remember that the author on one of the files called it a shape morph. It is kind of a morph, and that's how you can distinguish it between the motion tween and shape tween. Shape tweens are very often used to morph an object into different shapes. So you can control how that morphing happens by using shape hints. Let me show you how that works. I'll select File, New, and we'll just create a blank file on our stage. And I'm going to use the Polystar tool for this and go to my properties and choose star and choose 5 sides. I'll hold the shift key down and I'll make that, looks like it's got a fill of white, which is not going to help us here. So we'll fill it. Okay, there's my shape tween. I'm going to get rid of the stroke because the stroke, when you're dealing with shapes, is a real, when you're dealing with shape tweens, the stroke can just add a lot of labor to the whole process. So there's my star in the middle of the stage. I'm going to go out to frame 30. I'm going to insert a blank keyframe because I want to morph this shape into a different shape. So I'll insert a blank keyframe and I'll choose to make a, well, for right now, the simplest thing to do would be to make it into a polygon. So I'm going to choose a polygon and choose OK. And I'll have a different color. And I'll get rid of that stroke as well. And I'm getting control of those elements in my properties panel. And I'm going to put that right in the middle of the stage. There's my next shape. So I got my first shape. There's my first shape. There's my second shape. 6 minutes. So what I do is I have to use the key. I can use the menu up top, but this is a very pain in the neck menu. You'd have to go Insert. Where is it? I can't even find it here. Insert. How about Modify Shape? Well, I have to select it first. Let me do that. Select my shape. And then I would say Modify Shape. Why isn't that showing up? Oh, because I haven't tweened it yet. Okay, so my first step, sorry about that. So we're going to create our shape tween first. I right-click anywhere between the 2 keyframes, and I choose Create Shape Tween. And we see the way it's working is that this star is just rotating slightly and turning into this polygon. So what I want to do is I want to select this first keyframe and choose Modify Shape, Add Shape Hint. And that's that keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-H. Command-Shift-H on the Mac. What it will do is it will put this little red dot on the stage. So I'm going to move this red dot to the top, and then I'm going to use my keyboard shortcut Control-Shift-H 4 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4. And what it did was it created the letters A, B, C, B, C, D, E. I've already got my A. So I'm going to move that E to the end. I'm going to move my D down to this point. I'm going to move my C to that point, and my B to that point. Now I'm going to go out to that last keyframe where it has the polygons, and I'm going to show you 2 different ways that this element can rotate. First of all, I'm going to take this E and put it up here, down here on these corner points. And you'll notice when I assign shape hints from the first keyframe and then apply them on the second keyframe, they turn from red to green. So now my rotation looks like this, which is pretty similar to the way it did before. But what happens if I want to invert it, maybe make it a little more interesting? I can take this shape hint from A, maybe move it down here, and put E over there. Actually, I'm going to move these all around for a second. A is going to go down there. B is going to go there. E is going to go there. C is going to go here. And D is going to go here. In other words, I moved my shape hints in such a way that now when it morphs, it spins like a little ninja star. Okay? So adding shape hints is an easy way to create some more interest when you're doing a shape tween. Okay, so we've covered our list of topics for today. Quickly, what the homework is. The homework is the easiest assignment that you get this semester. All you have to do is review the videos 1 through 5 on the Adobe website. And these videos talk about, come on, allow. I don't know why that's doing it, and that's a pain right now. I'm sorry about that. Adobe, you're making things hard for me while I'm trying to teach. And you'll see that we see the Flash interface, the welcome screen, the main menu bar, the toolbar, the stage, and the work area. Those are the 5 I want you to review. You're familiar with those already. This will just really solidify that information for you. Okay? So I want to get off of this page because I don't know why it was doing what it was doing. It's just a pain. So that's all you have to do for next week. The homework due yesterday it's fine for me if you turn it in tonight by midnight. So hopefully I'll get a few more people turning their work in. And at this point, are there any questions? Okay, where can you review other people's work? As I sent in my email last week, on the Flash homepage, the Flash homepage has a link to student work examples. On the first link, Homework 1, Creating a Static Flash Movie, that's the first assignment that you submitted. The second assignment, which is due as of midnight, I will get that gallery up by tomorrow, since it's due at midnight. Tomorrow morning I'll put that gallery up. This is not like Kate Online where you can just drop a file into a Dropbox. Kate does not support viewing SWIFTs, so I have to do all the work myself. Okay? This video will be available within an hour to 2. As it says on my FAQ page, all the videos the closed captioning has to be attached to them, and then all you have to do is go to the online resources archives page and click where it says Flash, put in your username and password, and then apparently you get to do that twice. High security there. And then you click on this link to go to the list of master recordings, and then today you should see a 5th recording show up. You simply click on that play button. Okay? Anything else? Pleasure, pleasure. Okay, folks, I'm going to end this recording, and please feel free. I know this was an abridged session, but my knee is in need of meeting with the doctor. So please feel free. I'm feeling great, thanks, but I just want to get to the doctor because I got the appointment. If you have any questions, email me. I'd also be happy to meet with you online if you have to do it that way. And keep in mind that when I meet with you online, I can talk to you on the phone and see your screen. So it's not like you're not going to get a full personal experience. You're really going to get, in many ways, better than face-to-face because I can look at your screen, you can look at my screen, and we're talking on the phone the whole time. Okay? So thanks again. I really appreciate when people show up to class. It makes it a lot more fun for me. And I will see you all next week.